Okay, welcome to today's webinar on sunset clauses and post-legislative scrutiny. A few practical points at the start. We will be recording this webinar in order to make it available to those people who can't join today. We have a large audience attending, but we want to make this an interactive discussion. So we encourage you to write your questions, comments, or any other experiences with sunset clauses in the Q&A box. So with that, we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us for this webinar on sunset clauses and post-legislative scrutiny. My name is Franklin de Vrieze, the Senior Governance Advisor at Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and I welcome you to this launch of a new research publication. By way of introducing the theme for today, let me say this. Due to the COVID crisis, sunset clauses have gained importance in policy debates. But sunset clauses have been around much longer. Whenever an emergency situation occurred, sunset clauses have been used. Whenever a tricky political issue needed to be overcome, sunset clauses were used as a mechanism in legislation. So what are sunset clauses? They are a clause, they are an article in legislation which sets an expiry date on a particular law or a set of provisions. And so the sunset clause says that the legislation expires either automatically or following an evaluation that the legislation needs authorization by Parliament. Now, one of my colleagues said, this is a bit nerdy. He said, it's a bit niche. Yes, it is, but it is also big policy. It is a tool to unlock complicated decision-making, to gain political leverage. So sunset clauses are sometimes also regarded as safeguards of democracy, particularly in the context of emergency legislation. At least that is what it promises. That is what it projects. That is what is expected. But does that also happen in reality? Do sunset clauses fulfill their promise? And under which conditions are they useful? And how are they related to the exposed impact assessment of legislation, which we call post-legislative scrutiny? So these are some of the key questions which we will be discussing today. And it's based upon a research which has been conducted in cooperation with the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London and Newcastle University, thanks to the work of the two co-authors, Dr. Maria Musmuti and Dr. Sean Muller. So let me briefly introduce them here for you. Dr. Sean Muller is a Newcastle University Academic Track Fellow in law at Newcastle Law School. He's also an associate of the Political Settlements Research Program at the University of Edinburgh, and his research covers areas such as children's rights, international human rights law, peace agreements, and transitional justice. And most recently, his work has examined emergency laws in response to COVID-19, particularly in conflict-affected societies. And Sean was previously a lecturer at Northumbria University. Dr. Maria Musmuti is an Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London and the Executive Director at the Center for European Constitutional Law, a research center based in Athens. Her research in the field of legislative study deals with the concept of legislative quality and effectiveness, legislative design, gender-sensitive lawmaking, and post-legislative scrutiny. And she's also a WFD associate expert, and both of our speakers are also the co-authors of today's publication. So now I want to give the floor to Dr. Sean Muller. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Franklin. Thank you to everyone for attending. It's much appreciated. So what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit of context for the paper, sort of some of the ideas that made us want to write it in the first place, and hopefully set up the discussion for Maria, who will follow on. So the broader context, as Franklin said, really is COVID-19, the pandemic. So we know that it was a novel virus in March when it first arrived, created a significant sense of fear, panic, and an overarching sense that we needed governments to respond and to respond fast. Now, some governments, of course, did relatively little, at least initially. So, for example, Brazil and Indonesia. But in the main, governments adopted quite similar measures globally. So there was lockdowns, quarantines, travel restrictions, school closures. but governments used a range of different legal frameworks or groundings to do so. So some declared a state of emergency in line with their constitution, for example, Colombia. Others formally derogated from international human rights obligations under international law. But other countries relied on legislation. So some countries used existing laws, often public health acts. So for example, Nepal and South Africa. And other countries adopted new legislation. A useful example here is Papua New Guinea. And then you have contexts like the UK, which is somewhat of a hybrid approach in the sense that new legislation was adopted in the form of the Coronavirus Act, but the vast majority of stat arrangements have actually been laid down under the Public Health Act, which was a piece of existing legislation. But regardless of the measures adopted or the legal basis upon which the measures rest, there's always a fundamental tension with emergencies, whether it's a natural disaster, war, or a public health emergency. And that is that on one hand, you need governments to be able to respond, so they have to have flexibility, increase in powers, and often a corresponding rights, a corresponding limitation put on rights, often justified in the name of the greater good. But then on the other side, that there's inherent risk that these laws and powers become normalized. So they move from the exception to a state of normalcy. And in order to offset this, different models, different legal frameworks have different responses. So for instance, constitutions will often define the circumstances that allow for a state of emergency to be declared and will stipulate who can declare a state of emergency and under what conditions and what rights cannot be violated against. Now, sunset clauses come into play when we talk primarily about the legislative model, so relying on legislation. And as Franklin said, they essentially set an expiration date on a particular law or set of provisions, and the expiration date is either automatic or subject to a positive or negative authorization by the legislator. So they introduced two regulatory messages. First, that legislation will expire at a set time, and second, that this expiration date is conditional upon some decision by Parliament. And these have been used, again, as Franklin said, in a range of different contexts: investment law, tax law, contract law, but they are frequently used in the context of emergencies and on the basis really of their theoretical merits, so what they supposedly can achieve. So what can they perhaps achieve, at least in theory? Well, on one level, they can safeguard democracy. So when we're talking about emergency legislation being passed, it's often fast-tracked. So the normal processes of review and scrutiny that we would expect from legislation is not possible. And with a sunset clause, then there's a possibility that at least at a later time, we can debate these things in more detail. And this allows for more information to be available and also to evaluate the extent to which the legislation has achieved its objectives. And ultimately, then this can make these temporary laws temporary in the sense that they will come to an end. And this idea of normalcy does not happen, where the exception becomes the norm. And as countries adopted new legislation in response to COVID-19, for example, the UK, Scotland, Singapore, sunset clauses were really pushed as a safeguard against this risk of normalcy. And at the outset, I was quite concerned about this, as were others, because we can look at the experience of sunset clauses in different contexts. And particularly if we're talking about emergencies, what is a useful context is the counterterrorism context. And what have been some of the problems of sunset clauses? Well, very often they actually fail to terminate the legislation. So despite the sunset clauses, the provisions continue on. There are often quite ambiguous terms as to when the debates will occur and who's responsible for overseeing them. There can be limited time afforded for the debate itself, incomplete information to help inform the debate, and insufficient time allocated for them. And I think when we look at the UK, particularly in the early stages, these were borne out. So the Coronavirus Act, for example, has a sunset clause which states that the act will expire after 2 years. But there's also a provision which allows for a period of review every 6 months, and the legislator can then vote on whether or not to extend or to cease the temporary provisions of the act. And when we look at least at the early reviews, we can see some of the problems. So firstly, the idea of a 6 month period is quite a long time, considering the extent of the rights infringements that were contained in that piece of legislation. The initial debate lasted only 90 minutes, and when you look at the extent of the piece of legislation, one would argue that this is not sufficient. The 2 monthly reports, which are supposed to help inform those debates, were very descriptive. And indeed, perhaps one of the main problems has been that most of the statutory instruments that have been used to ground the range of measures came under a completely different piece of legislation in the form of the Public Health Act. So on one hand, you have this idea of the theoretical merits and benefits of sunset clauses matched against the reality where this potential is often not realized. And this is not a particularly nuanced position to adopt because, as I say, if you look at the counterterrorism context, the limitations of sunset clauses are very well laid out. But one of the things we wanted to do in this paper and with this research is trying to think about, well, what might some of the solutions be? How can we approach this from a drafting perspective and what changes or improvements could be made? And also in terms of the review itself, what could we do? What might be done differently? And I suppose the overall objectives to start a debate as to how we can transition this idea of the theoretical benefits into practical realities. And so with that being said, I'll pass over to Maria, who will talk a little bit more about the technical drafting aspects and also some of the recommendations and ideas that we produced in this paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean, for this excellent introduction. I know you have to leave us now, but much appreciated for joining us today. For our audience, if you have any questions, feedback, or own national experience which you want to share, please do so and put them in the Q&A box. And so now we have our second speaker, Dr. Maria Musmuti. She will elaborate further on the study and on the recommendations. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Franklin, and thank you, Sean, for explaining the context. I will just add on to what Sean has already said by taking a slightly different perspective. So I will try to look at sunset clauses from the perspective of legislative quality. And it is not my intention in this context to drag you into complicated discussions about what legislative quality is and so on. I will just give a working definition of what it is to me. And a good, an effective sunset clause is one that can communicate its main messages to all those who are interested. And this would be the criterion that I would apply to look at different sunset clauses in order to see what works, what doesn't work. And this is what we try to do in this research. So we tried to juxtapose the theory that Sean already referred to with the actual practice of sunset clauses. And we tried to look at how things work in practice and then try to improve them. So looking at sunset clauses from a drafting perspective, a good sunset clause has to communicate three main important messages. The first one is with regard to what is actually expires, what expires from the legislation. Is it an entire act? Is it just specific provisions or sections or parts of the act? So what expires is one important thing that a sunset clause needs to define. When it expires is the second very important legislative message that has to come with this clause. And the third one is what kind of requirements are associated either with the expiration of the clause or with the extension of the validity of the clause. So, of course, there's much more that we can say, and we can go into more depth. But in my mind, these are the key messages, the key legislative messages that a sunset clause would have to clearly set out. So, looking at practice, what we found is that there are three main things that usually go wrong and in relation to these key messages. And the first one has to do with the way that the reference to what expires is phrased. I mean, it might sound surprising. I know, how complicated can it be to say that this section or this act expires, but I think there has been quite a lot of creativity in trying to make this complicated. And I'm using here an example from the US Patriot Act, which is a notorious sunset clause, if I may use that term. The problem with it is that you have to read through it 2 and 3 and 4 times, and you're still not sure that you have a crystal clear idea of what it is that actually expires. So the mention to exceptions and then the references to subsections, everything comes together to create a very complicated picture about something that shouldn't be complicated at all. Instead, it should actually be very clear. This is what expires and this is what does not expire. So the second point on which things, again, sometimes go wrong in practice have to do with when something actually expires. And this might come even more as a surprise, because how complicated can it be to put an expiration date to something? Well, it can, because the expiration date often does not come as a date, but it comes as a complicated formula which is calculated in reference to different benchmarks. So, and this is an example from the Coronavirus Act 2020 in the UK, where the expiration date is set at the end of the period of 2 years, beginning with the day on which it is passed. So again, someone who wants to know when this actually expires would have to dig a little bit deeper and do some research in order to find on which day the act has been passed. It's not extremely complicated for an expert in legislation, but it might be slightly more difficult to do for others who are not specialized in working with the law. But this is not the worst example that I've come across. So I think the most complicated formula in order to define the expiration date comes from Canada and the Anti-Terrorism Act, where the date has been set. The specific section ceased to apply at the end of the 15th sitting day of Parliament after December 31, 2006. Honestly, I really do not know why it has to be so complicated, and why all of these formulas, the 15th, 16th day, why the 15th and not the 20th, why not the 13th, and then the sitting day. Who knows how to count sitting days after December 31st? Why not just give a date, as the Scottish have done, where in the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020, it very clearly says that Part 1 expires on 30 September 2020. And I've already spotted that example, so I'm not just using it because Andy Beattie is honoring us with his presence today. But in my mind, this is a clear way of defining when something expires, in this case, Part 1. So the third thing that actually goes wrong is what Sean already referred to, and has to do with the requirements that are attached to a substantive review of the legislation that is due to expire or to be extended. And this is a slightly more complicated issue, because it doesn't only have to do with drafting, it also has to do with parliamentary practice. But drafting can also help improve the parliamentary practice. So in many of the acts that we examined and the sunset clauses that we examined, there is just a requirement for a resolution from from one or both houses of parliament, or as is the case in the COVID Act in the UK, a motion to be debated and voted on. There's no more detail on what are the issues to be looked at, which might be a reason why reviews lack focus when they take place in real life, and especially given the fact that in emergency legislation or in anti-terrorism legislation, sunset clauses are usually linked to contentious issues within the Act. It would be important, I think, to include in the sunset clause at least the areas on which the review should focus, just to make sure that these contentious issues are not missed. So these are the three things that we found can go very, very wrong in real life. So if we try to flip this and look at the positive side and try to come up with some ideas or some proposals of how sunset clauses need to look in order to be effective, in order to do what they promise to do, I think there's one thing that we need to agree on, and that is that they need to meet a very high level of clarity, specificity, and an ambiguity. And if this is the aim of every act, fine, but especially for sunset clauses, because of their function, I think an extra effort is required in this regard. And the second conclusion that we came to is that they can, as Sean already mentioned, they can actually safeguard democracy and human rights and legal certainty, but they need to fulfill two important conditions. And one is for them to be drafted in an effective way. And the second one is for them to be accompanied with a meaningful review process. So some key issues that are linked to these two conditions, as I've already made clear, I hope, a very specific reference to what expires, a very specific reference to when whatever it is to expire actually expires. And then when it comes to the substantive review requirements, a little bit more focus and a little bit more emphasis on the things that are important for the review in the given context of the sunset clause. So what is subject to review? What is the scope of the review? Is it the cost effectiveness of the measures? Is it the effectiveness of the measures? Is it whether the objectives have been met? Are there other specific aspects that we need to look at just to make sure that these are not missed in the time that has lapsed from the adoption of the law and the introduction of the sunset clause till the time that the review actually takes place, because it might be 2 years, as in the case of COVID legislation, or 6 months, but it might be 7 years, it might be 10 years. So quite a longer period of time. And of course, who will have to be involved, what kind of procedure. All of these are issues that given the circumstances and the context, can help in making the review linked to the sunset clause a little bit more substantive. Of course, a lot depends on practice and on a parliamentary practice, but to the extent that you know that an enabling framework can actually be provided, I think these are some ideas or some guidelines about how to frame it in a more specific way. And these are things that are normally used in review clauses when they are used on their own in legislation. So they are not really new. So just that from me, and I'm very, very much looking forward to your reactions and questions and ideas or practices, and of course to the comments from Andy Beattie and other participants. Over to you, Franklin.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this excellent list of examples you have given, and I'm sure this will trigger probably also some contributions from participants in sharing their own experience. So further to these two presentations, we have asked Mr. Andy Beattie to provide a response on the report. And Mr. Beattie is the Chief Parliamentary Counsel of Scotland. So for information of the audience, the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel drafts all bills for the Scottish Government's legislative programmes, ensuring that the laws are of the highest qualities, that they are clear, effective and accessible. Mr. Andy Beattie has joined the Parliamentary Council Office in 1999, at the same time when the Scottish Parliament was re-established. And he has spent the following years drafting acts of the Scottish Parliament across a wide range of topics. And he is also active international and has a long-standing interest in helping develop and maintain legislative standards internationally. So today we have asked Mr. Beattie to share his experience of drafting and working with sunset clauses. Andy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Franklin, for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be asked to be the first to respond and contribute some thoughts of my own at the launch of this publication, and for reasons I'll come on to commend it to you all and to thank Sean and Maria in particular for preparing it with such diligence and skill. The publication is right to acknowledge that sunset clauses are not really a new thing. It was only a very short time into my drafting career that I first encountered a legislative sunset. There is a road bridge in Scotland over the River Clyde, just to the west of Glasgow. It's called the Erskine Bridge. Some of you might even know it, or even had the joy of crossing it on a trip to Loch Lomond. But the sunset over that bridge that resonates for me is not the one over the Scottish mountains and countryside behind it. Instead, it is the sunset clause, which appeared in the Act of Parliament passed in 1968, which authorised the charging of tolls for cars passing over that bridge. That clause provided for the Act to expire at extendable intervals of 5 years. For some reason, never entirely clear to me, the sunset clause was overlooked, and the Act expired in early September 2001 without anyone noticing, including, rather unfortunately as it turns out, the 26,000 or so motorists who continue to be charged to cross the bridge every day, despite the lawfulness of those charges having disappeared into the sunset. It fell to me to draft emergency legislation which, metaphorically at least, reversed the direction of the sun. It pulled it back up over the Bridge Tolls Act and restored the lawful authority for the tolls. And what I learned from this was that not only is the undertaking of the sort of sunset review advocated in this publication normally a wise course of action, in relation to any legislative sunsetting, it's also sensible not to entirely forget it, at least before darkness falls, that the sun does always set. I will say a little bit more about some of my subsequent brushes with subsequent sunset clauses, but before I do, I can't but help respond to some of the references to drafting, even poor drafting, in the publication, although I take great heart, I have to say, of the claim in it, and as Maria said, for one of the most recent Scottish examples, for which we'll take full credit, my team will anyway. I would say that drafting sunset clauses, like drafting all other legislative provisions, can be highly complex. Drafters need to ensure that the mechanism works, taking into account the multitude of statutory and interpretative rules on transitions, savings, repeals that come into play whenever a law expires. And these are very often some of the most fiendishly tricky provisions to get right. More generally, the existence of an expiry mechanism will nearly always cause a drafter to ponder over the much broader, wider drafting approach which is taken across the Act, bearing in mind how this new temporary law is to merge and be presented within the existing permanent statute book. So while I don't doubt there's poor drafting out there, and there's some possible examples up there, I'm sure I may even be responsible for some of it myself. I would, for reasons far beyond solidarity with fellow drafters, urge a degree of understanding when judging the standards of these provisions. I've not yet met a professional drafter who does not always strive to produce clear law, and these days who's not keen to learn from users of legislation on how drafting can be improved, as I myself am doing today. Since my first encounter with sunsets and bridge tolls, I have, over the past couple of decades, come across many of the types of sunset clauses and reviews mentioned in the publication. One of my earlier experiences, it's, as drafters, you very quickly sometimes come across the constitutional ones, extraditional and armed forces legislation to ensure that Parliament can review on a regular basis the Crown's right to raise an army. But, it certainly, to my experience, at first was initially perhaps that sunsets were most common in situations where parliamentary time was allowed for full scrutiny of legislation, but often for something itself which was considered temporal, whether a state of heightened terrorism or public health threats, or a one-off event. like the Commonwealth Games or the European Football Championships, which we've held quite recently in Glasgow. But more recently, there has definitely been more examples of sunset clauses proposed, which could be said, or at least perceived to be said, as compensating for expedited scrutiny. The COVID legislation, as has been mentioned, has drawn much more attention to sunsetting, of course, and it's a perfect example of the type of law that ticks both boxes. It deals with what we all still hope is the temporary problem of the COVID pandemic by way of legislation that had to be devised, drafted and scrutinised, of course, at breakneck pace. Time, or lack of it, often one of a drafter's biggest foes. I personally am immensely proud of the Herculean effort my team put in to get COVID legislation in great shape in the very limited time available, but no one, I don't think, would claim that the intensive 24/7 working that was involved then is in any way an ideal environment in which to create very well drafted law. I'll finish with just one reflection on a more recent phenomenon which is touched on in the publication, and that is the role of sunset clauses and what it describes as, I think, consensus gathering. My experience is framed in Scotland, and that may differ from other places wherever you're tuning in from. It differs from Westminster in particular, as our proportionate electoral system means that a single party majority is a rare thing. It's happened only once in the 6 Scottish Parliament sessions so far, and even then produced a slim majority of only 1. Consensus gathering is, of course, critical in minority or coalition style situations. And my own view is that consensus politics and compromise, while sometimes causing issues for drafters, are generally a very good thing for legislative scrutiny and then ultimately for quality. But for those interested in good lawmaking, I would recommend perhaps always just raising a cautious eyebrow at sight of a proposal to include a sunset clause, not where the situation is temporary or where we're in an emergency and the bill is going through very quickly, but solely because the policy being implemented is controversial or simply disliked. Where the bill concerned is going through a full parliamentary scrutiny process, possibly after a very full pre-introduction consultation process, conceding a sunset clause to help secure votes needed for passage might well be viewed as inconsistent with best practice, if that would allow a future parliament, perhaps of a different persuasion, to allow the law to revert under the sunset to its previous state without having to undertake the full scrutiny processes which were needed to change it in the first place. So I would say that sunset clauses by themselves, and not just for that reason, are not universally a good thing. And if these sorts of cases ever arise, it is of even more pressing importance to consider putting an appropriate review mechanism in place to ensure equivalent scrutiny is given to any law before it changes back. And also, I think as my Erskine Bridge case demonstrates, there may be times when emergency legislation itself is made, where adding a subsequent post-legislative review process would be almost entirely pointless. So, on that note, I would conclude by emphasising my view that the need and desirability for a legislative sunset should always be considered on a case-by-case basis to ensure that each piece of legislation is designed to meet its own unique circumstances. And you might expect me to say that as a drafter, but I do believe it's true. If sunsets do keep proliferating as anticipated, and I expect that they might, even if not absolutely always for the right reasons, it is without doubt invaluable to have comprehensive analysis of the type set out in this publication to inform their development. And that's why I'll just finish now by repeating my thanks to the authors, Sean and Maria, and by commending this publication to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for highlighting, I would say, the art of drafting, but also the importance of the review process that is most welcome for us today. So finally, we have a contribution from Dr. Sarah Mose from Australia. She is a senior lecturer in law at the University of South Australia. Now, due to the time difference, Dr. Mose has recorded a message for this webinar, which I will be sharing with you right now.
Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Mose. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of South Australia in Adelaide, South Australia. I'm very excited to be part of this webinar discussion on the excellent publication produced by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy and colleagues, Sunset Clauses and Post-Legislative Scrutiny, Bridging the Gap Between Potential and Reality. I join you from a very hot and steamy 40-degree day in Adelaide from Kaurna land, the traditional Aboriginal owners of the place that I work on. And when I read this publication about bridging the gap between potential and reality, it has particular resonance here in Australia at the moment. The Australian lawmaking system is a federal system, and we've seen the use of extraordinary executive lawmaking powers be exercised by state and federal governments here in Australia in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The use of these emergency powers has sometimes come with sunset clauses and other mechanisms for review, but in many cases, there's been no parliamentary scrutiny review of extraordinary executive lawmaking powers that have significant positive and negative impacts on the rights of people in Australia. And so this publication is going to help lawmakers here in Australia and the broader Australasian region to reflect on whether or not sunset clauses can trigger meaningful, deliberative review of the type of measures we've seen employed recently by our governments. My perspective from my research into parliamentary committees and also my interest in generating a sense of democratic and deliberative engagement with parliaments here in Australia is that until we have a culture of meaningful review of legislation and executive lawmaking, sunset clauses will be limited in their ability to translate into important improvements in the content and structure of the law. But I remain optimistic, and partly that's because by comparing different experiences like the Westminster Foundation for Democracy has done in this publication, we can see glimmers of hope that we can test out and try in other places. So for example, examples that include just particular criteria for review that force a level of public engagement in the process of reviewing laws at sunset provision deadlines, we can start to see the potential for a more diverse range of voices being considered as part of that post-legislative review. I wish you all the best for the webinar and congratulate you, the authors, again on this excellent and useful publication.
So many thanks go to Australia for this contribution, and we are now actually ready for any comments and questions from you, the audience, wherever you are. And then Andy and Maria will try to respond to the questions. There is one contribution coming in just now in terms of an example from Georgia, saying that sunset clauses lead to a constitutional debate. Is it constitutional that the government and one ministry are entitled to impose rules through resolutions and decrees about restrictions or references made to curfew, limits on flights, restraining various economic activities? So this delegation of rights happens through amendments in several laws, and it has been prolonged several times. So the experience here that the debate was quite formal, and there was a constitutional claim filed by several persons, and so a decision well, is not yet available in English, but mostly the court rejected the claim. So this is the experience from Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. I don't know if Maria and Andy, you want to reflect on some of the issues mentioned here in this example. Another question also asked for a couple of examples or references with specific to the expiry date discussion as well. So also any comments on that are welcome.
Thanks, Franklin. I might take me a moment just to digest the Georgia example, but the expiry date one, which is there, I'll maybe add some comments on, just elaborate on something I was saying. It was great to see our example up there with using just a date, which is a good thing. What times to use is often something as well. We very often, or we now always avoid using midnight as a time for obvious reasons. That causes a bit of confusion as to which midnight you mean. But in terms of the drafting, I did see some of those examples, and I would be, as I indicated, always a bit cautious about jumping in those examples as to why they were set out like that. There can be some very good reasons why you might not want to set out a particular date. I mean, I can think in Scotland, for example, we have a slightly different system for securing royal assent, including a period in which bills can be challenged. I can think of at least one bill relating to the European Union, which was passed around 3 years ago, which has still not received royal assent and may never do. So if you put an expiry date in there, for example, it would be difficult. So I think you always need to look back at that. I do think on the back of that, there are often other things you can do to try and make it clear. It might be the drafting needs to be done in a particular way. Bills are accompanied by explanatory notes. I mean, I will big that up in Scotland. I mean, in recent times, that just since the start of this parliamentary session, we in our office and Parliamentary Council have started taking the lead on drafting the explanatory notes, and that might be a place where you could explain in plainer language what the technical precision which was needed in the Act might be. So all different places will no doubt have their own way that they need to refer to expiry. There is magic in some of the words. If you use the word expire or cease to have effect or repeal, some of those words have well, not quite magic, but what we record that because they hook into things like interpretation provision and cause other things to have effect. So the drafting of those sorts of things often needs to be done in very particular ways, which admittedly can be quite opaque. Although, as you have seen in our most recent example, we do always try and make it as clear as possible. So hopefully that is a response to a bit of that. I'll have a think about the second one and allow Maria to come in.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. In the meantime, another question came in from Portugal mentioning that some of the emergency legislation includes clauses which preview the end of the law, but not a review. Can we call it a sunset clause at all? And then another question is, what is the process of selecting an expiry date to a sunset clause? So these are excellent questions, which we now pass on to Maria.
Thank you. And thank you, Andy, for your response. I think I would like to pick up 2 points that you made that I think are particularly relevant to the entire discussion, but also when trying to respond to these questions, is that, first of all, sunset clauses are not the solution to everything. You can use them and they can work, but you need to do that with, you need to use them with caution. And the second one is that you need to consider the specifics on a case-by-case basis, because every law is different, every emergency law is different, and there are different circumstances that need to be taken into account and addressed. And I would again like to come back to the point that both Andy and Sean and Sarah raised with regard to the review as being the key process, right, that links the preparation of the law and the life of the law after it has been adopted. Now, on the case of Portugal, and I'm not really sure what preview is rather than review, so I don't really need to. I would really need to look a little bit more into that in order to be able to respond. With regard to selecting an expiry date, that's an interesting question, and that has to do a lot with the mechanics of the sunset clause. It's not a technical thing, just to pick a date, as Andy already mentioned. And of course, there are reasons why the formulation of the expiry date might be very complicated. But in my mind, it still does not alter the ultimate fact, which is that it needs to be clear. Whether it is by using the explanatory notes, that's fine, as long as those who are interested can really understand when something expires. Now, what to consider when trying to decide what the expiry date is? It's a good question, and it's essentially a policy making, or a question that lingers between policy making and drafting. You need to consider what the sunset is linked to, whether these measures are really temporary or emergency measures of with a short life, or whether these are longer. I mean, I've seen in Australia they have a blanket sunset clause for all legislative instruments, and the sunset clause is set at 10 years. There are others where you have 7 years. You have others at 1 year or 2 years, as we've seen in COVID legislation, with shorter time frames. So I think the nature of the phenomenon that you're trying to regulate, and the issues that you're trying to capture, and the considerations of when it would be a good time to actually look back at these considerations, would be the questions to lead the decision-making process with regard to an expiry date. There's also another comment from Professor Kouroutakis, who has written extensively on sunset clauses with regard to whether shorter timings can be linked to a more superficial type of review, which is a very interesting observation. Again, my response would be that we need to look at this on a case-by-case basis, because not all laws are the same. I mean, COVID laws and anti-terrorism laws, or laws to respond to emergencies like earthquakes or tsunamis, have a very different nature. So I think what we might need to consider a little bit more is how to make the review more substantive by taking into consideration both the time that is required for a substantive review, but also the key elements and the data that you need to collect from the implementation process in the review. So just that from me for now, and I will keep up looking at the questions and hopefully come back with more in a moment.
Thank you very much, Maria, particularly for these last points, highlighting the importance of the review and the preparation, the data collection for the review, and the review on the impact of the legislation. There is another question which came in regarding whether there is a difference between legislation with sunset clauses and experimental law. So, Andy, can we go to you for that?
I can have a go at that one, Franklin, absolutely, not least because I think I've done a bit of both, and I can maybe touch on some of the others either. I mean, this comes back to the point which I was glad to hear Maria agreeing with, that all legislation needs to be considered as to, you know, what's the best solution in this case. So a sunset clause is often, you know, we've described, and the publication goes into the reasons you might want to have an end date or a review before it. An experimental law is something, you know, your automatic reaction might be, well, let's have a sunset clause. There are other ways of doing that. I have drafted legislation in the past which has had, I think we called them piloting provisions. So it was an ability to start the law up in particular areas or in particular circumstances, to allow it to be tested there, reviews and reports made, and then a subsequent power to extend the law and make it permanent after that test had been done. So that's a kind of the reverse of a sunset, as it were. It's a kind of sunrise in a way, in that the full extent of the act only came into force once something had been trialled, scrutinised and reported. So how you describe them, I think, can always be different ways, but there are always different ways of doing things, and drafters can always be quite creative on that. On selecting expiry dates, I mean, that's an interesting topic as to whether, again, I touched on whether you put a date in. We did put, of course, put what we thought at the time was a very obvious date for the expiry of the European Football Championships Act in 2020. But then we, of course, had to come along later and change that date when the championships were moved themselves to a year later, and it required a little bit of legislation. And the COVID stuff as well. I mean, at the time, there was, I certainly remember there were some voices saying that it all seemed quite long term, particularly given the extent of the powers that we're taking to take them for 18 months or 2 years. But as it's transpired, and we all unfortunately know, the end dates of that legislation turned out to be too short as well in some cases, and needed to be extended. So you can't work out at the start what the date is, which again can sometimes lead to different approaches, allowing things to expire when someone is of the opinion that something reaches. But I mean, that really does lead to more ambiguous legislation. But whether it's best in any individual case is always a matter of judgment. And that's why I would repeat my mantra is you need to decide what is best in that particular case, judging by what the legislation does and the situation it's attempting to deal with. So hopefully that's a helpful contribution.
Thank you very much.
And if I may add, Franklin, I fully agree. I mean, experimental legislation is a much broader concept and a very interesting one in my mind, and it's linked more to a review process in the sense that testing or piloting new approaches or new ideas or new ways of regulating some areas are always linked to an effort to evaluate what their results or effectiveness has been before making the decision of how to proceed, meaning to generalize or to change the idea or abandon the idea in the first place. So I know that the French have even included a provision in their constitution allowing for legislative experimentation in order to make this kind of experimental laws possible. So again, a very interesting concept, but one that is only partially linked to the rationale of sunset clauses because of the temporary nature of the experimental legislation in question. And we also have an interesting suggestion about a potential follow-up to actually see whether sunset clauses have resulted in the repeal of the law. It would be interesting to see how many of them have actually achieved what they were there to achieve, right? Or to what extent reviews have been extending and extending. I mean, judging from the Patriot Act, the sunset, I think most of the provisions that were meant to expire have not expired even today. So, I mean, I'm sure we can find some good examples where sunset clauses have really not worked in real life.
Thank you, Maria.
Sorry.
Yes, Andy?
Sorry, I was going to say, obviously I have at least one experience of one sunset, unfortunately expiring by mistake. The experimental law that I referred to earlier, it was in relation to a change to elections law, and actually it was sort of fully reviewed and evaluated, and it was decided not to continue the law. So the act was drafted in a way it would then kick in and repeal itself. So I am aware of some circumstances in which these reviews have then resulted in the law not being either continued or fully enacted. There probably tends to be more examples, and you'll have come across far more than me, Maria, from across the world, where they do tend to be extended. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not right to keep reviewing them. Just because there's a tendency for them to be extended, that there can still be good reasons. The example I gave in my talk is one of the earliest ones. I mean, I think it's been going on for a long, long time, probably centuries, that at Westminster, the Armed Forces Acts come back to the Parliament to ensure that Parliament is happy with the Crown's right to raise an army. Now, you might expect that to continue forever, but it doesn't mean that it's not right, that it shouldn't keep happening.
I fully agree. I think that the whole essence is in the review, the substance is in the review rather than the sunset. And in the the weight should be on the review rather than, because the expiry is the result of the review. I agree. And I often refer to the example of Australia, where they have introduced this blanket sunset clause for legislative instruments set at 10 years from their adoption. And they actually review the way in which this blanket sunset clause works. And they will keep on reviewing it every 10 years to decide whether it's still valuable and whether it's actually contributing to keeping the statute book tidy and in good order. And so I fully agree with you, Andy.
Good, thank you. We have one question still coming in here regarding delegated legislation. So when we speak about effectiveness legislation, should we be concerned about the actors, processes, and the context of delegated legislation in determining effectiveness?
Yeah, you know, when you mention the word effectiveness, I jump up. It's my favorite word. So I will say a few words on that. Definitely. I mean, that's a whole new chapter. Delegated legislation and the role that Parliament has in scrutinizing delegated legislation, or in looking at the effectiveness of delegated legislation later on, the government, the Parliament. It's a whole new discussion, and of course it makes a lot of sense, especially in countries where a lot of the decisions are delegated by the law to the executive in the form of regulations. So yes, it is a very important aspect of it's a very important thing to consider when looking at the effectiveness of legislation.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we have one comment also. Someone wrote about the duration of the sunset clauses, saying, from my experience, if the duration is short, in most of the cases it is renewed and the review process is not very strict. So any final comments on the duration of sunset clauses?
I would like to give Andy a go, because I tried to address this before. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, said a little bit about the duration there. I mean, obviously, the amount of time you've got to consider the legislation affects the amount of time you've got to review it. The COVID legislation is a good example of that, and I think there's certain aspects of ours needed to be considered every 2 months, which in itself is almost an industry, because it means as soon as you've finished one review, you need to start the next. But of course, it's always justified in cases where the legislation is either considered to only be needed for very temporary circumstances, or is considered to be doing something quite extreme, which is only needed because of particular circumstances. So again, I sort of come back to my point. I'm glad to be able to come back and hopefully conclude on my point, which is you need to look at the circumstances. Obviously, the longer time you're given to review something, and also you need to ask who's doing the review and what are they looking into, will affect the quality of the review. But you need to balance that against how often do you need to have reviews, and that can, that is influenced by the impact that the particular piece of legislation will have. That'd be my take on that one, Franklin.
Thank you very much.
And when will you have substantive information to consider during a review? So yeah, sorry, Franklin.
Yes. So we are close to the end of this webinar, unfortunately, already, but I want to mention 2 things. First, I want to mention that this publication is part of a series. It is called the PLS series, and it's accessible on the WFD website. Now we have 2 other recent publications here, which are worth mentioning. One is Post-Legislative Scrutiny in the Westminster Parliament by Dr. Tom K. Gill, and a comparative study on post-legislative scrutiny of election campaign finance legislation in Indonesia, Nigeria, and Moldova. So that is accessible on our website. And then finally, I also want to mention that we are currently working on a project of designing indicators for post-legislative scrutiny by parliaments. And the PLS indicators will be presented on the 24th of February at the Parliamentary Development Community of Practice. So save the date of 24th of February. Further announcement will be made next week. With that, I want to thank our excellent speakers for the introductions today, and you, the audience, for engaging with your questions, remarks, and country examples. I hope this was useful. So thank you very much, and see you at the next occasion. Goodbye.